All right, I've got a new series of videos I'm doing. In May, you may have noticed that I was doing this first in, first out thing. DVD Talk forums website was running a little, they're contests like the October Horror Challenge where you try to watch 100 horror films in a month. In May, you kind of do your own challenge, and that's where I came up with this first in, first out, where you watch all the oldest purchases you've ever made. And so finished that up for the month of May. I knocked out maybe 30 DVDs. It still only got me to like 2003. So I'll probably go back and do some more. But in June, so there's a new challenge in June. The point of the story is there's a new challenge in June at DVD Talk Forum called the Historical Appreciation Challenge, where you watch movies about characters, real life characters or events. They don't have to be documentaries necessarily, but they do need to be movies based on some version of real events, whether it's a real character or real events that occurred. So I've started on The Hollow Crown, which is, there's now two of these. There's the War of the Roses period and then the precursor to that. So I started with the precursor, which includes it's a BBC film series from 2012. It includes Richard II, Henry V, and Henry VI. So I started out with Richard II. And I'm a sucker for, just right out of the get-go, besides slasher films and horror movies, I am a sucker for medieval history and the kings and queens of England. I mean, I just love movies and documentaries about that period, books. I mean, Winston Churchill's books of the history of the English-speaking peoples is an excellent source for learning about the events of medieval history and forward. But there's, of course, other books along the way. But so I use those as a resource as well. But this film is a 2.5-hour version of the Shakespeare play about Richard II. And, of course, a lot's been made of the ineptness of Richard II and his, basically his effeminate ways and his kind of just strange, he's a strange, odd character that perceived himself to be some kind of a Jesus Christ-like figure, a deity. He, as a king, he was one of the first kings to understand napkins and handkerchiefs and forks and spoons. I guess everybody ate with their fingers prior to this, but that's one of the stories. But he fancied himself as kind of godlike in this film and in the Shakespeare version of events. Now, when you read about it, a little bit of background about Richard II, he was the he was the grandson of Edward Longshanks. Of course, most of you should be familiar with Edward Longshanks because he was the king that hovered over William Wallace in the Braveheart movie. And so he should be familiar to you. He had a son named Edward the Black Prince. I guess named Black Prince because during his period of reign, the Black Plague wiped out a third of the population. And then along came his son, Richard II, who at the ripe old age of 10 years old became king. And he ruled from like 1377 to right up to 1399 when he was overthrown. And the storyline with him is that he was not a warrior king. He hated fighting. He viewed himself kind of as a godlike deity, but he was very passive in nature. But he was also kind of a greedy, as most of these guys were, very greedy, and he taxed, right after the Black Death in the 1300s, you've got an issue of serfdom and a control of people where you got the rich versus the poor, and you got taxation going on that's pissing people off even more. And then you've got these land grab situations where the lords and the counselors are in and around Richard, who kind of manipulated him because of his age, exploited the populace through land grabs and taxation. And then he became, as he got older, he did the same thing basically. And there's discussion that would indicate that he wanted to abolish serfdom, but I think then there's other people who say, well, he did it just to appease the peasants, but he never really abolished it. He just continued on with his policy of taxation and land grabs. This movie takes on the events of Richard II towards the end of his life and career, right at the last 2 years when he's basically a young adult in his 20s. He has been basically grown up around a council, including Lord of Gaunt, John of Gaunt, I'm sorry. He, played by Patrick Stewart, by the way. John of Gaunt, who was the brother of Edward, King Edward, basically has gotten used to de facto ruling the country because Richard was a kid. And then, of course, John of Gaunt's cousin, Henry, who became Henry V, is Richard's cousin, and that's where the film focuses, is the conflict between, the brewing conflict, if you will, between young Henry and young Richard. And what happens is, essentially in the film and the story, is that Henry gets into a dispute with another land baron, and they decide they're going to settle this dispute the honorable way and fight it out on a battlefield. Richard II intervenes at the last minute because he's really not a big warmonger fighting person, and says, we're not going to do this. I mean, they'd already mounted their horses and they're getting ready to go at each other, and he stops it. So it's kind of like the only best analogy. Well, it's not the best analogy, but having sex but never coming. I mean, so the people were like, this is unacceptable. People wanted to see some bloodshed at that point, and he aborted it preemptively. But what he did do is he abolished and banished Henry and then his opponent out of England. And then he made a fatal mistake of going to Ireland and leaving England exposed. And when he did that, Henry, with his band of forces, invaded through Yorkshire and took over, essentially, and ousted Richard II, threw him in the Tower, and then had him killed. Although historical events would indicate that that's not clear, but in the film, he's murdered. Murdered by his own followers, his own previous followers, by the way. Interesting film. It's 2.5 hours, as I said. There's a 20-minute making of documentary. If you're not used to Shakespeare language, it can be a little tiring at times. It's definitely Old English, so sometimes it's hard to follow. In fact, I think had I not read up on it and been familiar with some of the events, it would be even more difficult. But it's still an enjoyable watch, and Ben Whishaw, I believe is his name, that plays Richard II, did an excellent job. He does present himself as this godlike deity, kind of above it all. Almost like multiple personalities. He's just strange. And I can imagine, if you were raised, in his defense, first off, if that was how he was, we're talking about the 1300s here, so nobody really knows, but if that's how he was, imagine yourself at 10 being crowned a king and having to grow up under this a very unusual life bubble that he lived in. So I can imagine his brain, his wiring got really pretty screwed up with what was reality versus what was fantasy by having just grown up and never had to deal with real life. Strange. And then he had all these politicos, lords around him, manipulating him and those type of things. So, yeah, I could see how you could be pretty screwed up having had a childhood like that. And quite honestly, the other thing is these kings and queens in Europe slept with their relatives. I mean, Richard II is a product of two cousins marrying and having a kid. That's his father, Edward the Black Prince, married a cousin essentially and had Richard II. So the genetics are not working in their favor because they tried to. At that time, obviously, there was some thought that you keep a royal bloodline and keep it pure, but mixing the same genes like that as we know today is bad news. So that may have had something to do with his mental state as well. Interesting stuff. If you're in medieval history, kings and queens of England, I can definitely recommend The Hollow Crown. So that's Richard II. So next up, we're going to do, or I'm doing. I'm right now just starting Henry IV. I was saying Henry V earlier, but Henry Bolingbroke, basically the cousin of Richard II, overthrows Richard II to become king. That's Henry IV, not the fifth. Sorry. So yeah, Henry IV, and then his son, who eventually succeeds the throne, which is Henry V. And after that, those events essentially in the battle between John of Gaunt, his son Henry IV, and Richard, the Plantagenet line, if you will, most people would argue that whole battle resulted in what we now know as the War of the Roses period, and that's this series of films that was a follow-up that I'll also be covering is the War of the Roses period. So yeah, quite a bit to go, and each of these films are like 2.5 hours each. In fact, Henry IV is 2 parts for 2 hours each. So got a ways to go, but I'll be covering those as well as other historical related factual type movies in the month of June, along with the other stuff that I typically will watch. Quite a number of things coming up, like The Hustler with Paul Newman and Tora, The French Connection, all kinds of things like that. So hope you enjoyed this video, and appreciate you watching.